So we're a design firm that was founded in 2005. Before that, I've been an art director for a long time. My training is as a human factors engineer, but I've mostly been doing design of some kind for a long time. And at the Action Mill, it's a little bit difficult to sort of say what kind of design we do. Some people would say that we're experienced designers, user experience designers, game designers now. We used to call ourselves action designers, so we design things that people do. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our work, but we're not going to talk for very long. We're going to move to playing the game first, and then you can ask questions a little more afterwards. But I'm going to try and give you a really sped-up version of how we got where we are, which is a design firm that focuses exclusively on end-of-life communication and decision-making. So while we sometimes do stuff that is a little bit tangential to that, all of the work that we pursue is within the sort of death and dying area. We've been doing that for the past 2.5, 3 years. But before I talk about my work, there's one thing that I wish somebody had said to me when I started off with design, which is that you should always document your work, which is why Anya is here. So these are actually photos of a recent design project I did with Maggie Breslin. Maggie's in there. This is our design studio in Philadelphia. So design, particularly this kind of design, innovation, all of this sort of stuff that is not graphic design, is kind of a funny animal. It's something that I think we can very quickly forget that most people don't actually have any idea what we mean when we say design. And I can't tell you how many times I've tried to write a paragraph about what I mean when I say design, and it never quite works. But a paragraph describing it with some photos makes a whole lot more sense. So Anya is here, and she's going to be taking some photos of me talking, which actually is something that you kind of need to have if you're going to be a designer. But she's also going to take pictures of you all playing the game. So we want to be respectful. Is there any, and I should be clear, we use these pictures to promote our work. Is there anybody who doesn't feel comfortable having their photos of them playing the game used to promote our work? Okay, you can always change your mind later. When we get started with the game, just pull me aside. It's totally fine and really acceptable for you to just say, yeah, I'm not really comfortable with that, and we'll make sure that it doesn't happen. We have a whole system set up to do that. So, let's see. Where should we start? So, let's talk about how we got started in design. So my co-founder, Jethro Heiko, and me, we've been working together for about 18 years, and most of the stuff that we do comes from a sort of early inspiration and looking at a particular designer and how he designed for social innovation, basically, designed for social movements and created huge, huge social movements. And most people don't necessarily think about Gandhi as a designer, but we, both Jethro and I, spent a lot of time actually studying Gandhi's work, and that means actually going back to the original documentations. Gandhi was actually one of the earliest people who you could actually get almost all of the things that he wrote on a daily basis. It's something like 25 volumes of writing that is mostly really mundane stuff. So you can actually dig through it and find out what he was doing on a day-to-day basis. So what we started to notice when we started to look at social movements, and Gandhi in particular, is that the two biggest campaigns that he did, the Salt March and the push against the boycott of cotton cloth, were both not just based in speeches, they were based in giving people something to actually do. On some level, it was service design that he was actually doing, right? And he did this in a way that was very different than anybody else, we would argue, before him in history, that he had actually created a new way of creating social change. So Gandhi was working for Indian independence, but he was doing it in this very different way, even than the people who were the other leaders in India. He really believed that it wasn't about just throwing off British rule. He didn't want Indian rule to replace that. He really believed that independence meant that everybody should have the ability and the skills and the resources to be able to make their choices about their own future on an individual level and then on a village level. So let's talk for a second about what the situation was in India, just in particular about commerce. So in India at that time, the way that people bought clothes or any other kind of cloth was people in India would pick cotton. That cotton would get shipped off to England, to British mills, where it would get turned into cloth and then brought back to India and sold back to Indians. Mm-hmm. It was a tremendously inefficient system, and it meant that most of the resources that were being spent in England, not in India. It was also a completely unnecessary system. India had, for centuries, created as much cloth as it needed. But just saying that didn't actually do anything. Lots of people had said for a long time, this system doesn't make sense. And there were other kinds of systems like that. Salt is another example where salt was a monopoly in India at the time of British rule. But Gandhi didn't just make a bunch of speeches about that. He set about to try and create a new, different way of creating cloth. And what he did was he invented this. This is a box charka. Has anyone ever seen a picture of one of these before? This is a spinning wheel. You often see pictures of Gandhi sitting at a spinning wheel. You almost never see Gandhi sitting at a spinning wheel that's one of these big wheels actually using it, because it's not what he actually used. This is what he actually used on a daily basis. So this, and for designers, this is useful. The number of iterations to get to this is enormous. And there's actually a museum in India that has a whole bunch of the iterations that it takes to get from what was originally a spinning wheel, which for centuries had been about that big, and used only by women and used in the back room, so no one ever really saw it. And by the time Gandhi came around, in fact, it was really difficult to find a spinning wheel at all in India. He spent months just tracking down his first spinning wheel, and then a lot of time learning how to use it. So what Gandhi did was he created a new thing out of the spinning wheel. So this spinning wheel is different in that it's portable, so you can carry it everywhere. It can be used by anybody, and crucially, it can be used in public. So that's a big thing that we think about a lot when we're doing design for social intervention. We call it design for social intervention, innovation. All of these things that are social have to be done in public, if possible, right? So Gandhi actually used this spinning wheel every single day for decades, and he made all of his own cloth, all of his own clothes. But more importantly, he also required that all of his followers did the same thing. And what he was doing was actually creating an entirely new textile industry by doing this. So if you wanted to be a member of the Indian National Congress when Gandhi was the head of it, you had to own one of these, which meant they had to manufacture them by the hundreds of thousands. Then they had to make sure that they had to get all of the cotton, raw cotton, to the right places so that people could get it. And then everyone who was in the National Congress had to spin every day, and you had to make your own clothes. So try and think about what that does to a group of people. Rather than saying, we want there to be a different way to create textiles in India, you actually start doing it. We think about it a lot as taking Gandhi literally. So people often talk about be the change you want to see in the world, which there's a question about whether or not Gandhi actually said those specific words. But we take that very literally whenever we start a project. So in this case, Gandhi is saying, we're going to actually create this new textile industry. And that's going to give people a chance to actually experience the change that we want to see. So imagine if a leader today did that. So imagine if instead of a politician getting up and speaking about what they thought should be different about the oil industry, what if they actually went out and created a way for people to actually experience a different way of doing things? And that's sort of what we're always trying to do. We don't necessarily always, we're not reaching the level that Gandhi was reaching, but it is something that we always are striving for. We're always looking to create a way that people can create the change that we're talking about in a real way that they can experience with their hands. I've wondered all over what I was going to say, so we'll see what the next slide is. So let me give you one example of the work that we do. This is an example from a few years ago when Iran and the U.S. Iran and the U.S. don't have great relations right now, but there was a period in like 2007, 2008 when it was particularly bad. This is the axis of evil time. So we got hired by a nonprofit to try and encourage the idea that there could be meaningful dialogue between Iran and the U.S. And we think really hard about how you get to the heart of the issue and make it possible for people to really experience it. So again, after many iterations, what we came up with was an idea of trying to get Americans and Iranians to talk directly to each other. So what that meant was that we spent 6 months on online forums with Iranians, recruiting Iranian volunteers. And once we had a few volunteers, we set these up. This is actually in City Hall Park in New York, but we set these up in different locations around the country. So this is a phone bank, and the red phones are each connected to a cell phone, and each cell phone is dialed into a person in Iran. And we set these up in public spaces, specifically where there was no other sort of political conversations going on, and just offered Americans a chance to have a 5-minute conversation with a random Iranian. And we definitely didn't recruit for political ideology or anything else in Iran, so we really didn't know what was going to happen. And we didn't put any restrictions on the conversations that people were going to have. And what happened is that people wound up picking up the phone and having conversations about pretty mundane stuff. They talked about the weather, they talked about their neighborhoods, they talked about like what kind of cars they drove, all sorts of things like that. But what happened was that people started to get this idea that you could actually have a conversation with an Iranian. You start to see that people aren't actually that different. And, crucially, we documented it. Spend a lot of time being careful about how you document this sort of thing, particularly when you're working with Iranians. You have to be really careful about how you document it. So no one from Iran had their name used in any of this. But at the same time, participating in a project with a bunch of Americans like this was relatively dangerous. So the number of Iranian volunteers was pretty low for most of the time. It actually got more, I would say more Iranians knew about this campaign than Americans did, though, because Iranians put it on email lists and sent it all over the place. So we did this for, I think, 3 or 4 years in everywhere from Seattle to DC. We did it with a group of U.S. Congresspeople, did it outside of their offices. We had the Libertarian candidate for president get on the phone and talk to a retired oil engineer in Tehran about how they had actually grown up in the same neighborhood, because the Libertarian candidate for president that year, his dad was in the Foreign Service. So we had these sort of interesting conversations going on, and we did this for a while. And this is just sort of to give you a sense of this is the kind of project that this is one of the ones we're particularly proud of. It's the kind of project that we really like to do, where we get people actually talking to each other, and we kind of don't know what's going to happen. Because people start to surprise you. For instance, you get a 12-year-old in Iran who asks her parents whether she can be on the phone with Americans, and that 12-year-old in Iran gets to be on the phone with a U.S. congressperson and have like a 15-minute conversation about whatever she wants. That's a kind of an interesting way to get people to think differently about whether or not Americans and Iranians can actually get along. So we did this for, I should also say we got a lot of coverage, particularly outside of the U.S. This is actually the very first one we did. This is the first iteration. You'll see there's only one phone and it's tiny, and this is in Boston. This got a huge amount of coverage, including in Der Spiegel. So we did this kind of work for a long time, and then we got a sort of strange request. The state of Vermont was trying to put together their health insurance exchange, and they realized that they had a real problem of getting people to talk between departments and between states. So all the different states are setting up health insurance exchanges at the same time. They have to do it very quickly. They don't really have the same goals necessarily, even department to department. So they hired us to help them with that problem. Just come in and help them have better conversations between departments, between states, and between states and the federal government. As you can imagine, this is a much, much bigger job than we had done before. We grew about 10 times our size in a matter of 2 months. And for the first 3 months, it went really well. We had a lot of success. We had a lot of really interesting, we got a lot of interesting conversations going on. I would argue that we got to listen in on a lot of the stuff that later became all the things you read about in the paper about the health insurance exchanges not working. We got to listen in on why that was actually happening and tried to do a little bit to help. But because we grew too fast, and for a variety of other reasons, things started going south very quickly. We started working too hard. We all gained a lot of weight. I think collectively it was on the order of like 70 pounds among the 3 partners. It was extremely unhealthy. We were fighting a lot. We were not paying any attention to our own business. We were basically just working as contractors directly for the state of Vermont. And 10 months into a 3-year contract, we got fired. Just like out of the blue. Didn't see it coming, didn't know what was happening. We were in Vermont and heard that we should come into the office and got canned and had to walk out and say, so we have 12 employees and no work. That was the other big mistake we made. Never have one client.
Yeah.
It was a horrible, horrible idea. But we didn't know better. So that's why I'm telling you. So we were in bad shape. We had months of legal issues. I mean, just because you end a big contract doesn't mean you're actually done with it. We worked with lawyers for 3 months to get ourselves unentangled from the state. We had set up offices in Vermont. And at the end of that, I always try and point out, there was a lot of crying. No one talks about crying in design. There was an immense amount of crying. There were actual separate spaces in our office for all of us to go and have a good cry at the end of the day. Because I identify with my company, and we all got very close, and we all said things that we probably regret, and certainly our clients said stuff to us that they probably regret, I like to think. It was awful, really awful. But we decided that we should, rather than run out and try and get clients, that we should take this problem seriously. So we decided to take ourselves on as a client for 6 months, and we did all the same things that we do with clients. We ran through all the exercises with the Post-its on the wall and trying stuff out and interviewing people and stuff like that. And that actually turned into a year. So we spent an entire year just trying to redesign our company. We changed everything about how we work. For that entire year, we worked 4 days a week. No work on weekends, no internet on weekends, no email at night. We have a large number of emotional management tools in our office now that help us navigate really difficult issues, because the other thing they don't tell you about running a small business is that it's an emotional nightmare. It is really, really hard to work very closely with people when you're both responsible for them and responsible for getting business. And at the end of that, we were interviewing hospice nurses because we figured hospice nurses probably knew something about resilience, and we wanted to learn from them. And they said something really interesting. They said that they could tell the difference between a family that had one conversation about death before they got there and the ones that didn't. And the ones that didn't, they couldn't really do much more than try and help them navigate those conversations. The ones that had a conversation about death, they could actually provide them with good health care. And that sounded like a problem that we could actually help with. So we did a bunch of different projects, and one of them is our sort of public-facing project. So the game came out of a challenge. The California Healthcare Foundation issued a challenge for people to design tools for end-of-life conversations. So the game was we took 3 days and designed it, and it didn't have any of the questions. It wasn't a game. It was just a box with an idea, and we were one of the winners of that. And we thought, we're almost out of money. We might as well go out of business doing something we really love. So we spent the next 2 months doing a Kickstarter and designing the game, which, here's another lesson. Manufacturing is a lot harder than it looks. Really, really hard. And you should always ask people who've done it before, because our second version of the game shipped 3 hours ago. And it is 1/3 the cost of the original one, which makes a huge difference in a small business. So I'm not going to tell you very much about the game, except for I'm going to show you how to play it. We're all going to go out and we're going to play it, and then we'll have a few minutes at the end where you can ask me questions. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else. So the game itself, I'll just to be totally transparent, we don't make a huge amount of money off the game. We make a little bit of money off the game, but it's as close to a box trucker as we've gotten, because people play the game and they are fundamentally changed. And I don't mean that on a level of oh, I feel like I'm different today. I mean marriage proposals. I mean talking to your father for the first time in 20 years, that kind of stuff. It's a pretty good game. Not to set the expectations and stuff like that. I try not to, I usually don't say that, but you all, if you hate it, I'm totally fine with that too. It would actually be really valuable because we get very little negative feedback. And it's partly because we own this space. Like, we are the only design firm that focuses on this. So what that means, and I'll just say this about focus. Focus is a really important thing because it makes it possible for you to be really, really good at something. We're really, really good at designing tools that help people talk about death and dying, which means when the Institute of Medicine needs somebody to do that, there's only one company. So we were single sourced for the IOM project to do that a couple of months ago. There's just no competition. We're not making a pile of money, but we don't have anybody that is really competing against us, and it's a really nice place to be. And we're getting to do stuff that is really meaningful. Like, I love my work. It is super hard, but I love it. And we built all these tools in the last, in that year that allows us to navigate all of the really difficult things when somebody, in the middle of the Kickstarter campaign, Jethro, one of the other partners in the Action Mill, his grandmother died. So, he's gone for 2 weeks, and we're still running a campaign about death and dying and talking about death and dying and stuff like that. And you have to learn how to navigate that and how to get Jethro on the phone and say, let's talk about your personal life, and then I'm going to have to talk to you about our business, which, by the way, is death. So I'm going to stop talking. Let's go out. Follow me. Okay, so here's how this works. At the beginning of the turn, questions are numbered. Take the first question first. I'm going to start with question 47 because no one is going to get to question 47, and we're going to use that to get started. So at the beginning of the turn, one person takes out a card. They read it out loud. Everybody writes down their answer silently. Put your pen down when you're done writing. That's the signal that everybody knows that everyone is done writing. When everyone has put their pen down, you go around. Whoever wants to start can start. Go clockwise and read your answers one at a time. Once you're done reading your answers, then you can have a discussion about what the answers are if you want to, and then you move on to the next question. So that's the sort of structure of the game. These are called thank you chips. Everyone should start with the same number at your table. So there's a different number of people, so I want to know different. Thank you chips work like this. Anytime anybody does or says something that you appreciate, give them a chip. You can say why if you want to, but you don't have to. You can give as many chips at any time as you want to anybody at the table. So we're going to demonstrate really quickly how this works. This is, as we said at the beginning, talking about death is a little bit scary. Talking about death in front of other people is a little bit scary, even for me. And I recognize that this is a scary thing, so I appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna read the question. Skylar's already written it down. I have done this a couple of times, so I know what my answer is going to be. What is the last meal you want to eat, and who would you like to join you? So everybody would write down.
My palms are sweating.
Are you okay?
Yeah. I'm really nervous.
Okay. Do you want to go first? Or want me to go first?
Yeah, will you go first?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this was actually one of the first questions that we wrote, and this comes from a lot of experience in the last few years of dealing with large groups of people. Sort of a weird thing to say to a large group of people, but I don't do that well in large groups of people, even close friends. I don't actually want a big last meal. I would actually like a couple of people to visit with me at a time. So I don't actually care what I eat, and I don't. But the company is important, but it better be small groups. So that's what I want.
Okay, great. So I wrote. So I have to admit, my first thought upon hearing the question was that I don't feel I'd be very hungry at the end of my life. I feel like I ought to just be almost fasting, really. So I'm going to go with a beverage, an amazing smoothie, with a lot of the spices that I find very comforting, like Indian spices and chai, and vanilla, sweet. Like as I started thinking about it, I really got a sense for this smoothie. And I'd like to drink it. This was so interesting. I would like to drink it with my best friends, women. It was all women. It was very a coven kind of experience. It's like what I felt in childbirth. I definitely wanted it to be my closest women friends and my daughter. So that's I'm good at that.
I have to say, that is a really interesting answer. So one of the things about food is that people use it to comfort each other, and at the end of life, most people can't eat.
Yeah.
It's one of the things that the hospice nurses said to us in our very first interviews with them is that people don't know how to care for each other if they can't feed each other.
Yeah.
So one of the hospice nurses' biggest jobs is teaching you to care for somebody else without feeding them.
Yeah.
So you're right.
Yeah.
The last meal is sort of this weird thing
Yeah.
because most people don't actually remember their last meal because it's days or weeks earlier and it's usually not something very good.
Yeah.
So then you move on to the next question. We're going to play for a while. There's 47 questions. No one has ever gotten through more than 10 or 15 at the most. We're not going to play for very long.
Okay.
If you have questions, raise your hand. I'll come answer.
You're supposed to play a series of games, is the idea. So 47 questions are meant to be played over 4 or 5 different games, and then you're meant to play it over and over and over. So I played the same game over and over and over, and my answers change almost every single thing. And that's part of the thing about advanced directives is that so an advanced directive is a thing that you write down to say, here's what I want at the end of my life. But the problem with that is that your opinions change as you get experience. Mm-hmm. So the point of the game is that you have conversations over and over and over, and it evolves. And the original idea of the game was that you would write down your answers and then have them in a box, and you would see how it changed. Yeah.
So I was wondering about the significance of the order of the questions and how they were positioned one after, like how.
Mm-hmm.
Because it felt to me like there was a definite path there that we were supposed to.
There is a definite path, and the first 2 questions are the most important. They actually come from a different game that we developed to try and deal with the fact that we got fired. It's a game called Fear Rummy that we play we've never played it with anybody except for our own staff members. So the first 2 questions are basically getting you into the game and negotiating the boundaries of the game. So by saying your fears and your hopes, you're telling the other people what they want, what you want out of the conversation. And the rest of them are divided by 8 different topics, and they're meant to sort of have a rhythm to it. But the more we hear from people, the more like one question is really heavy for somebody and really light for somebody else. So it's intentional, but it doesn't always work that way.
I'm interested to know like some more of the context of like when you would play this game, who you would play it with. And you kind of already told me the outcomes, but just I feel like if I played it with my family, I would have a particular experience of like playing with like people that are my age or that I don't know that we're all younger. So.
Yep. This is definitely the largest group of sort of relatively young people that we've played it with. We usually play it with healthcare staff in larger groups like this. So, what was the question?
The context of like where and when.
So the game was. This is nice to be talking to designers, so I'm going to explain why we do stuff. So we picked the users that we wanted to have. The users were an extended family with what we call a cruise director, and the cruise director is the person in your family who like arranges stuff. The person who, if you go on vacation with your family, they're the person who buys the tickets and figures it out. So we wanted the cruise director to have something that they can put in the center of the table and start a conversation, but they wouldn't have to run. So it's meant to be played by multiple generations. The person we were thinking about was in her sort of 50s as the main person to invite people, but it winds up getting played in a lot of different contexts. A lot of strangers play it. We arrange public games. We call them Final Fridays, and so we invite people to come meet us at a lunch spot, and people come and play the game with us. And people find strangers much easier to play with first, and much easier to sort of think about going to play with their family after that. The only other thing I'll say about sort of context is we designed it for families, but part of what our business is becoming is training healthcare staff because they started using it within. There's palliative care teams that use it as part of the beginnings of their meetings because it helps people learn about each other.
Why did you decide? How did you decide it to be a card game, I guess, opposed to like a board game or a digital platform?
I think it could have been a board game. I think I have a tendency not to think that video games are particularly good for starting conversations because you focus on the video and not on, it's a little bit distracting, at least for me. And there's a lot of the stuff we do, we like design it and then we figure out why afterwards. But there is a fair amount of research that shows that board and card games make for better learning experiences if what you're trying to learn is a complex concept. You also get more just talking. Volume of amount of talking is higher among board and card games than compared to a video game or a game on a tablet or something like that, even when it's exactly the same game. I have no idea how to pick, so I'm just going to go this way.
I just have a question. Are there any resources that the game takes you to after you play it? Or I know you said like sometimes with palliative care nurses you play it, but in the situation if I were to play it with my family now and we don't have a need for those nurses, I felt like a lot of the questions I wanted to know more about like what are my options or what are some things that people usually do and say, because obviously a lot of these I never really thought of in depth before.
Yeah.
So I just want to know, like, I don't know, like, what's best.
So there's online resources. There's a downloadable guide to here. If you wanted to do an advanced directive, here are the questions you should focus on, and here's how you go forward with it. And then there's also general resources on talking about death and dying. And we also have a blog called Death and Design, where we blog about interesting, creative ways of getting people to talk and think about death and dying. So we mostly work in healthcare, but there's all sorts of people doing interesting stuff around funerals and around other things that have less to do with healthcare. So we try and provide as much of those resources as we can. But to be frank, the money for design is in healthcare, so we mostly focus on healthcare. And our biggest client this is being recorded, isn't it? It's fine. Our biggest client sees this as a way to drive interest in palliative care, so that they use the game to get people to come to them for exactly the kind of questions you're talking about.
I was going to ask, not necessarily about the game, but just the issue you deal with in design. It's a very tough issue. Just how it is to deal with that on a daily basis, and just hearing tough stories and designing for very hard situations and balancing that with like leaving it at the office, not taking it home. Things like that.
I don't think you can. We definitely take it home, but we spend an enormous. Very early on in my career, I saw somebody speak who said that you should spend 50% of your resources of your organization internally, and we do. We spend an enormous amount of if there is a disagreement in the morning, we work it out the rest of the day. We cancel all the rest of our meetings. We figure it out, and we devote a lot of time to it, which is easy for us to do because we own the company and we get to make those kinds of decisions. So it is not the easiest thing to do, but you get better with practice, and we spend a lot of time practicing, and I think that's what the game and the chips and all the other things that we do are all about, is giving you practice. And the secret thing is that it makes you better at other stuff. So other difficult conversations get much, much easier when you understand how to navigate this kind of conversation. Like deciding where to go for dinner is not a problem. Which in some cases it can be a really, people talk about games, Monopoly. Maybe you all don't play Monopoly, but like when I was a kid, when you played Monopoly, you got in fights with your siblings. Like Monopoly is not an easy game either. It's just that this one sort of has some things that walking through making conversations easier.
I'm curious about the process of how you distill this issue into 47 questions. Like, do you start with like an enormous amount of questions?
Yeah.
And kind of like filter it?
Yeah, hundreds of questions to start with. Here's the secret to Kickstarter. It's super hard to raise money, but you wind up with hundreds of people who can be your users. So they contributed, at least half the questions came from Kickstarter backers. And we also then tested with them. So we created a kit that they could download, print out, play the game themselves, and an observer's guide where they could take notes about what they observed and then send it back to us. So there's hundreds of questions sort of in waiting if we want to make another version of it, and we use that in other parts. So we have that as a big resource that we use in designing other tools for other organizations too. But yeah, it was huge. And it took us an enormous amount of time to whittle it down, and we basically decided we needed 8 things. But the only other thing I'll say about it is you just need some good questions. It doesn't. People will decide what they want the conversation to be about without. People talk about, oh, these are really good questions. You could have a different set of 47 questions, and you would still have a good conversation.
I'm also curious about the process, and because some years ago, me and a group of students, we conducted research about that related to design, and we went through different, the diversity of assumptions or conceptions or perspectives about that within different cultures.
Yeah.
So I was curious about how was your research process related to the cultural background?
So, I mean, the cultural background of the team definitely had a lot to do with what came out and, you know, what questions got chosen and stuff like that. But I think for me, the game has much less to do with the topics and much more to do with the processes of getting a conversation to happen. So actually, gratitude is the main thing, and gratitude is much easier to translate between different cultures. So there's a version of the game in Thai. It is being released in Thailand in a couple of weeks as soon as we work out licensing issues. And it's practically the same thing with a few different questions, but the thank you chips, actually they're thank you cards in that version, but they're very sort of similar. So I think it's a matter of what you're focusing on. So we know a lot about death and dying and cultural aspects and how people think about it, but the game itself could work for a variety of other things, and we focused really on designing a game for better conversations. Death is the topic, rather than focusing on a game about death. And there is actually one other game about death, and that one is much more sort of difficult to translate, because it's all about death and not about gratitude.
I'm curious about your process of collecting information or data or measuring sort of how this game and the learning outcomes that you set out for are being achieved.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love if you have any resources on why card games are helpful in that regard too, to talk to you after about that sort of research.
Sure.
Just curious about your own process around
Resources on game research, Tilt Factor at Dartmouth. That's where all of the interesting stuff on card games versus stuff. There's a particular paper there where they took the same game, put it in two different places, and watched the game. What's the other part of the question?
Oh, the other part is your personal journey, I guess, with monitoring and evaluating the learning outcomes of this particular game. How if you're doing any work around that.
I'm not sure if this is going to answer your question, but there's actually a research team at Penn State University, Hershey. I can't remember the name of the whole university, but there's a research team of physicians who specialize in palliative and end-of-life care, and they are working with a researcher at the University of Kentucky who specializes in communication. So the two of them are doing much more in-depth research than we can do, and they're actually we're not financially tied to them in any way, but we share resources and talk a lot. And they basically are recording whole games and then using transcripts to talk about what questions actually prompt what kinds of answers, but also the quality of conversation. There's a white paper on the My Gift of Grace website that is all about the research at the University of Kentucky, which is fascinating stuff. It breaks down what makes for a quality conversation in general, and she's very focused. Alison Scott is the professor, and she's very focused on end-of-life conversations of what makes for higher quality versus more quantity, which is what most tools go for. Most tools are trying to get you to talk about it more, and she's very much into, if you have a good conversation for half an hour and I can measure it, then I'm going to have a better outcome. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It seems like catharsis was like consciously built into this game. It really was not an instrument type setting.
The what?
Like a brief group. I've been
Yes.
one and it really was healing in a similar way, where it's
Yeah.
like nothing only was sharing my experience and everyone else's thoughts on it. You kind of try to heal a little bit.
Yeah.
What if you did any research about catharsis and this happened?
Personal research. So the person who I founded the Action Mill with, Jethro, his dad died when he was 20 and in college, and he started a grief group for students, and that was his sort of entry into doing public service kinds of stuff, and that was a real sort of learning experience for him. And that's always been, grief has always been part of our work, even on, way before we were doing death. A lot of the stuff that you could look at with a lens of, they were rituals of grief. Because I do think grief a lot of people get stuck in grief, and we talk a lot about grief as a skill rather than as an emotion, because I think you begin to, if you look at grief as something that you can learn to get better at, then it's possible to sort of move through it. If you look at it as something that you experience from the outside, that you can't, you sort of like, you're subjected to it as opposed to having an active role in it. So we definitely, grief is talk about grief all the time. We have grief loops up on the wall and in our office. Grief is baked into everything we do.
Okay, I have two questions. One is, since the discussion part is the most important unit of your game, I would say, like, do you think it can make a big difference if it wasn't game? Like, it was like I don't know, like some of the program that just people would come together and talk instead of having those tokens and some rules.
Mm-hmm.
As a game. And my second question is how to measure and show the impact. Like if, like for example, like funder is asking to quantify your impact, like you got a great story how you told us in the beginning, but what else way you could also show the value of your product?
So the second part first, the one of the things about design is that most of the stuff, I think, that comes out of it is not quantifiable. I think you can quantify a lot of stuff, and it's important to quantify stuff, and we get that question all the time from people who want to hire us. How do we know that this is going to be a successful thing? And one of the frustrating things is that design isn't quantifiable. So we play the game in the first meeting. First, when we go out on a sales meeting, we play the game with the client before we do anything else, so that they have the experience of it, and then they can, they're sort of selling to themselves at that point. But there are things that you can do to quantify, and that's what the people at Penn State are really helping us with. We've formed a sort of good relationship with them where we've provided them with a tool that is different than almost anything else that's out there, and they've provided us with ways to quantify. So this researcher in the University of Kentucky did a very similar thing that you're talking about, sort of set of cards with questions on it, people sitting in a room, having a conversation, recorded, looking at the transcripts, and those conversations go like this. I mean, they're just awful. There are some of those conversations last 2-3 minutes, and those are people who those were all parent and adult child pairs. You can measure conversation quality by looking for certain indicators, and the quality is low.
Wait, what caused the quality to be low?
Talking about death.
Oh.
It's just any difficult. I mean, it doesn't have to be death, but any difficult conversation tends to go badly.
Yeah.
But there are indicators for what makes for a high quality conversation. Okay. The white paper will tell you a little bit about this. It's called the multiple goals theory, and basically, really quickly, the idea is that people look at the people are trying to accomplish goals in any conversation, mm-hmm. And we look at the things that are on the surface, which we call task goals. And those are the things that you sort of think of when you think you're having a conversation about one thing. But actually, there's two other kinds of goals going on in every single conversation that we have: relational goals and identity goals. Mm-hmm. Any conversation where they measure those 3 goals and how people attend to them, if only one of them or 2 of them are being attended to, people say at the end, that was not a good conversation. I do not feel good about myself. I do not feel confident. Mm-hmm. People who have conversations where they attend to all 3 goals at once tend to rate their conversations as higher quality. And that's how you get to the quantifiable part. So the researchers have looked at, 65 games, and they've got transcripts of every one of them, and they have people like pouring through the data and trying to figure out, and then they can say, so here's where the conversation started going well. And anecdotally, we don't have the research in, it'll be published in May. But anecdotally, what they tell us is that the thank you chips are the thing that help people attend to identity goals. Identity goals are all about how you're managing the perception of yourself. And thank yous are ways of saying, I recognize you. So you boost those. And relational goals also get built in there, but identity, I thought relational was going to be the thank you chips, but actually identity turns out to be the thing that's boosted by those. So, you know, like all of that is stuff I've learned. And it would be great if I had done that at the beginning when we were making the game, but we figured that out, you know, only 6 months ago. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I guess when people with a chip, if we allow the answer, do you think this habit of giving chip might make an upset with that? Like you take children or even adult, for example, do you think it might make people feel upset if they even get any chip?
It's a good question. There aren't very many games where people don't get chips, where people don't do it. There are some games where people just don't use the chips at all. They just ignore them. But there's not been a lot of games where some movement doesn't happen. And generally the way that people react to things like that where, you know, people don't get, I haven't seen people get upset about it, but I have seen people joke about it. Very frequently people will say, I don't, you know, like, why don't I get any chips for that answer? Things like that. But that's also an identity goal. So the alternative would be for somebody to sit and think, oh, I don't really feel like I'm being appreciated. But the chips give somebody a way to say, in a sort of jokey way, hey, I could use a little bit of appreciation, which helps you navigate the conversation even better. I was saying earlier that we use the chips whenever we have a difficult conversation. So like when we're talking about money, which in a design studio that is small and struggling happens a lot and it's not fun, we put the chips out and it helps us. We even do it when we're on Skype. So like I have a pile of chips in my office and I'll sort of pretend to give people the chips. It tends to be used in a funny way, but it's always possible that, you know, some people will have a bad experience with it. Yeah. Anybody else?
Can we get some feedback? I'd love to hear about their experience.
Yeah.
Any...
I have one more question then, yeah.
Because I have some experience of playing like a consultant game because of my experience as a consultant. And I think this game compared to some games I've played before is more straight, like a straight orientation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's quite different. It's really a lot different than some games I've played before because a lot of games I've played before like that, they just have some simple emotional words we try to like trigger you to say more. Yeah, but this case like okay, I have to give it a lot of information, so you have to feed me something from yourself. I think more attempting sense of attempting. So yeah, but I think still really good because in my group we found okay, this is a game we're gonna be talking about. So we still establish and then we try to talk about how we saw it in home. Yeah, but it's the first time I saw high speed ball.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, for myself, this.
So when we started off, people were like, you're not going to really make a game about this. And there are people, my brother is a big board game fanatic, and he was like, this is not a game. It's not a game. But the chips make it a game. And the chips make it a game. Oh, the one thing that we didn't do, it's just, I left out all sorts of stuff. There is a winner.
Oh, really?
Well, you don't get to have the winner, sorry. The winner is determined at the beginning of the game and hidden until the end of the game. You flip a coin, and at the end of the game, the person, if it's heads up, the person with the most chips wins, and if it's tails up, the person with the least chips wins. So you don't really know, but there is a sort of form of competition. And I think we played one time very early in the testing process and saw the chips go flying around and people talking about it and stuff, and then we sort of knew that it was a game. And I think that's the difference between it and a lot of consulting games. And on some level, that was luck. You know, we tried a bunch of stuff and wound up with a game that works. But I think it's also just like some faith in people that we like put a structure in front of you and say, do whatever you want with it, and then really tried to learn from them.
Just on that being a winner, because that was going to be my comment that I really liked. Like, we all left, nobody counted their chips and said like, I have more, I have less, and I thought that was really great. That like everyone was a winner because we were
Yeah.
all having this conversation.
People often ignore the winner or loser thing,
Yeah.
which is fine, but it's built into the game because it allows you to make, like, I think this goes back to your previous point about, like, part of being a designer is setting up rules and then watching people break them and loving that. There is nothing better than when people come up with new ways to play the game or change stuff around or, like, start picking cards out of order and don't care, and I'm not going to do the first 2 questions and I'm going to, like, do it over Skype, or, like, I'm going to play it on the road. Like, that's the best. But you can very easily, you know, be like, oh, well, these are my rules and I don't want anyone to break them. And I think that's like one of the key things about good design is that you gotta really love your rules and love it when people break them. I learned that, like, you know, as an intern at a design firm in Boston many, many years ago, and I think about it all the time. So feedback.
Yeah, feedback.
Yeah. Or experiences, or
I just have a quick follow-up question on that. I thought that was a really good point about not having a winner, and I was wondering, you know, so you like to break the rules, and we didn't get a chance to look at how the game set up the rules, and I'm wondering, do you say, like, suggested rules? Do you say these are the rules? How do you tee up the rules?
they're rules.
They're rules.
There's no point in having rules, but people can't break rules that are not real. So we say here's a way to play, and here's a couple other variations and stuff like that. But we intentionally read the rules of board games and structured them in exactly the same way. So when people in the middle of it start doing other things, that means that they have made a decision as a group to do something different than the rules, and that is a really powerful thing for a group of people to do. Breaking the rules in a game is not something that is socially acceptable. So I think that's a pretty important part of the game, is people saying, I'm going to do it this other way, and that is part of what forms them as a group. At least that's what I hope.
Yeah.
There was one group who, yeah, good. I don't know, never have I ever.
So it's like you put your hand up. It's like usually when you play like the game, it's like a card game where you put cards down in a circle, and each card is like a designation of activity.
Yeah.
And never ever is like you basically say like never have I ever like jumped naked into the beach.
Oh, yeah.
If someone's done it, they have to put a finger down.
Yeah.
And so like I think it's just the aspect of like just sharing and it being like just quelled by the fact that it's a game.
Yeah.
People say like absurd things, but it's like okay.
We're working on a tool right now that's not a game, but it is all about saying "me too" to stuff, and I think that's sort of similar. And we use physical ways to say "me too." There's little stickers that say "me too," and right, and it's a little silly, which is
Experiences like what I have the same experiences you would bring them together.
exactly, yeah. Other people's experiences playing, yeah.
So a lot of times in our group we would like write down our answers to if we were to like die today.
Yeah.
But then we also kind of discuss like since we're all relatively young, like hopefully unless it's a freak accident, we're not going to die for a long time.
Yeah.
But we also talked about how our like choices would change in the future when we did have like a family and like our own children, like how like that kind of stuff. So we kind of talked about the two different ways to look at it, if I was to die now or like in the future. So it was interesting to play with like young people who aren't really nice.
Yeah. So one of the goals we have is that people who play together will understand each other better, and the best way to understand each other is by telling sort of stories, or if this, then this. And that's built into the multiple goals framework that you can read about in the white paper if you want to. But there's a whole thing about the importance of telling stories and getting to know each other. Because when it comes to actual end-of-life decisions, the thing that people won't tell you is that an advance directive is almost useless. You are never going to run into a scenario that is covered in that. But what you are going to run into is a doctor who turns to somebody else in the room and says, what do we do? This person can't talk to me. And the people who you've told stories to, they can approximate what you would want, which is the actual goal of end-of-life decision-making. So advance directives are useful in that they point out that you've had a conversation, but in an actual emergency, they're not very useful. Sorry.
It's the same, by the way, it's the same with planning your childbirth.
Yeah.
It's
Right. It's the same with anything.
I'm like, wait, do we count the contractions? Okay, like our sheet, we had a sheet to put like the contraction and how long it lasted.
Yep.
And like, way after the baby was born. We found the sheet. We counted the first two.
Right.
And that was like my husband had written down the first two, and then all hell broke loose.
But you build trust in order to be able to work your way through complex.
We had to get there. I needed to feel secure.
Right. This is how, on some level, how soldiers feel. We did a lot of work with veterans at one point, and the idea that people somehow make decisions and then something happens on the field of battle is completely. That is not what happens. What happens is you look to the person on the left and the right, and you make sure that they don't die.
Wow.
That's what war is. It's not like some other, well, without the drones, but like, but on some level, like that's just an extreme version of any kind of complex decision making.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One more thing about I just have some playing the game. If the life is more, the environment more dark, I think will allow me to pull out my position.
You're not the first person to say that. And we have to figure out how to do sort of soft lighting in public places, because a lot of our work is around building public events. And that's a problem that we need to try. Oh, you can try that.
No, but you're talking about the actual light.
You're talking about actual light, but I think you can. But you can. There are things you can do that manipulate how we think about light. Yeah.
Did anyone feel like they want to play with their parents now, or no?
Wait. I want an answer to this question. Raise your hand if you want to play with your parents.
If you do want to play with your parents. And
Play.
you don't.
That's pretty good. People don't have these conversations.
No, yeah.
We interview people who are the experts in palliative care and end-of-life conversations and stuff like that. And at the end of every interview, they all say, "Oh, I haven't actually talked about it with my kids." No. I will. I mean, it's important. I mean, my kids are physicians, and so I should like. There's this myth. You're right that there is a movement to have these conversations happen, and yet the people at the top of that movement haven't had these conversations. I mean, I've only had a couple of conversations with my wife about it.
Yeah.
It's scary.
You say people don't have these conversations? Are you talking about Western culture?
Yeah.
Are you talking about?
I have not interviewed people outside of the U.S. and the U.K., but within the U.S. and U.K., there is a serious lack of real complex conversations about this stuff. There's plenty of people who say, yeah, pull the plug, which means zip in an emergency room. There is no such thing as a plug. There's no, that doesn't exist. There is no machine that you can unplug and turn off. That's not how it works. But that's the mythology. So we have that conversation. But the actual conversation about no, when I can't really recognize you, I think it's time for you to think about whether or not the next time I get the flu is the end of my life. That's a real conversation that nobody has. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, just literally to that point, I've had that conversation with my dad.
Which one?
Not exactly if I get the flu, but my dad's dad died, or my dad's mom died from Alzheimer's, and he decided, after she passed away, to me and my sister that if he develops Alzheimer's, he gets to the point where he's not himself anymore. He doesn't want to live anymore.
Wow.
I don't know.
Well, there are.
We're all witnesses now, but
Just to be clear, you don't have to kill him. There's a difference between killing people and letting them die.
Right, but I just say that.
Yeah.
Do have.
That's great. You're the first person who I've run into who has pushed back on that question, and I appreciate it. I think I think that's great. And you what? What was?
Did I get a chip?
I didn't bring chips. I did see somebody throwing chips out there, which was great. We actually have giant blue chips that are frisbees that we used to bring around. It's probably a testament to your relationship with your dad. That you probably, that will probably help you have other kinds of conversations, because it's great that you know that, but there will be other things that come up that, other kinds of decisions. And that knowing that will help you make other kinds of decisions. So I'm glad you're in a very small minority. So help us, get less of a small minority. Yeah.
And he just sort of talked about that like space in general. And I'm just wondering, in my head, I'm like, oh well, this would be a great tool for him to give to the family. But when would you give a tool like that to a family that's going through this without coming across as like your friend's about to die and here's a game to get better at that? Like, how would you? What's like the appropriate way to introduce it?
The only way to do it is just to do it. And this was not what we intended when we started, but it gets used in that exact situation. So there are, I'm trying to think of the number of different, there's a number of hospitals that use it in the ICU, and they use it not at the point where they want to start a conversation, they use it at the point where people are yelling and throwing stuff and threatening to sue the hospital. With relative frequency, there are 2 family members who've threatened to sue the hospital over the opposite things. So there are specific cases where chaplains have brought the game into the room and said, let's try just a couple questions. So part of it is just like, we're not going to do a lot, just 2 questions. We're going to, maybe we'll use the thank you chips, maybe not, it's fine. Something about having a game as an excuse for it actually makes it easier. And it's hard to get people to then come back and say, yes, we used the game for that because of legal reasons. But there are a number of cases where families have been able to make really difficult decisions actually using the game. Not a lot, more than 10, which is, pretty good.
Also wondering, like, do you see this game being something? I mean, you go to a hospital and families sit around just waiting to hear good or bad news. Could this be a game that is introduced in these waiting spaces?
Yeah. We would love for it to be in waiting spaces, for it to be, there's a hospital in the Midwest that bought 1,000 copies of the game, and they just give it out everywhere they can, and people use it in sort of random places. And there's a lot of things you learn by doing this kind of work, but one of them is that almost everybody wants to talk about this and is scared to talk about it, and the game is a really good excuse and a way to sort of ease your way into it. There are definitely times when it probably, when people have said, no, I don't really want to bring the game into it, but we haven't heard of a lot of cases where people introduce the game and it's a bad thing. If anything, it allows people to say, no, I don't want to talk about that, as opposed to just not talking about whether they're not talking about it.
I'm going to cut it off here because we're almost at 8. That
Wow,
was
really?
amazing. Thank you so much, Nick.
Thanks.